Hello everyone, I am the Method Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. Commander Cube Draft is a new mini-series where I'm going to be talking about everything Cube Draft, but related specifically to the Commander format. Throughout this series, I'm going to be explaining the process behind how I brewed my own Commander Cube, as well as pointers on how to brew your own. I'll also be reviewing and analyzing many topics and aspects when it comes to building your own cube. So in preparation for Commander Legends, the first Commander product designed to be drafted, I decided to begin this mini-series that will hopefully come to a conclusion after my Commander Legends episode of A Flight, after this set gets entirely spoiled. If you like any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. The best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For just $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Since this mini-series is meant to show different aspects of drafting a Commander Cube, if you want to know what a cube is and how it pertains to Commander, I suggest you first watch the first episode, which you can find in the link above. In it, I explain what a cube is, how the deck building process occurs when constructing legit Commander decks from a drafted pool of cards, and cards you drafted but didn't include in your deck will by default become your sideboard. This second episode of the mini-series was just about the sideboard and how to make the most of it using wish effects. In that second episode, I showed 3 cards that have to do with the sideboard, but they do so because they have a draft matters mechanic about them, those being Arcane Savant, Caller of the Untamed, and Volatile Chimera. These were more about bending the color identity rules of your commander by being able to copy off-colored cards in your sideboard. Recall that in a draft, whatever you pick that you don't use in your deck is considered part of your sideboard. However, this episode will be dedicated to those cards that have mechanics tied to the draft itself, like cards that let you draft more than 2 cards from a pack, peek at other cards, take account of how many cards you've drafted this round, adding more boosters to the draft, etc. These cards are a great way to tap into the actual draft itself and make it even more fun and interesting than just picking cards. Drafting a card that actually does something during the draft is one of the reasons I love the conspiracy sets, and I hope Commander Legends brings some of these types of cards too, since it's meant to be drafted. Or maybe we'll get a third conspiracy set soon. In any case, let's look at the cards and see what's worth including in your Commander Cube or not. Alright, let's start with analyzing all of the Draft Matters cards printed as of the recording of this video, beginning with Aether Searcher, a 6/4 construct for 7 mana. It might seem a bit costly, but that's because of its effect. Fortunately, you do get a somewhat decent body. When you draft Aether Searcher, you have to do so face up. Then you have to reveal the next card you draft and note its name. Then, during a game, whenever Aether Searcher enters the battlefield, you may search your hand and or library for any number of cards with a noted name, and you get to cast it for free. Drafting Aether Searcher is quite the gambit, since you have to essentially partner it with the next card you draft after it. If you draft it first, then you'll have quite a lot of cards to choose to partner with it. However, draft this too late and you might not get a good card with it. Will you be able to use it to cheat a really powerful spell, or just as a 7-costed tutor that will tutor up and free cast the card it's partnered with? It's not a bad card, but fortunately it's not broken. You get a 6/4 and a free spell for just 7 mana. This card is good enough for my cube, and I recommend it for anyone else's Commander Cube. Smuggler Captain is like Aether Searcher, except that you don't cast the card for free. You just tutor for it. So it might not seem like such an improvement for 3 mana less than the Searcher, as well as the fact that you can only run it if your commander has black in his color identity. That being said, it doesn't have the timing restriction that Aether Searcher has during the draft. With Smuggler Captain, you can turn it face down for whatever card you draft afterwards. It doesn't have to be the next card you immediately draft afterwards. That gives it a ton of flexibility, which is another trade-off. It's still a 4-mana tutor for just a specific card, so it might not seem that strong if you're running things like Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, etc. in your cube. But in a budget cube, or a cube that isn't so high power, it's definitely a great card. I run it in my own Commander Cube and recommend it for anyone else with a budget cube. Noble Banneret is another card with a linking mechanic that is tied to another card or you draft after it. In this case, it's not the next card drafted, but any other card you draft at some point afterwards. If you control both creatures, each one gets +1/+1 and lifelink. While not a bad card, this is better suited for cubes that aren't singleton like Commander cubes. Unless you have a lot of support to have both of these cards on the battlefield at once, it's not really that impacting in the game, especially when there's way better cards you can include in your cube. It's not a bad card, but I don't really see it for Commander cubes. It's a no from me. Paliano Vanguard is an amazing card for cubes that support tribal effects and commanders. I consider such cubes to be very difficult to balance as well as to draft and play with if players are competing for the same creature types. That being said, it might be possible for you to simply draft a lot of creatures that happen to share a creature type. Or maybe you drafted a ton of humans since that's the most common creature type. In any case, Paliano Vanguard is a lord that gives other creatures with the chosen types +1/+1. So if you drafted a changeling with it, your other creatures get +1/+1 for just 2 mana on a 2/2. It's not a bad card, but since I don't run tribal support of any kind in my own cube, I don't run it. Animus of Predation is the opposite in spirit as the cards in the previous episode of this mini-series. This avatar doesn't help you bypass the color identity rule by accessing off-colored cards from our sideboard. Instead, what it does is it removes cards from the draft altogether, meaning that they won't be in your draft pool. So they're not even in your sideboard, they're completely removed from the game. Now, how is this useful? Well, let's say you're drafting green-white or green-blue or green with anything else. But then you're past a Sphinx of the Steel Wind. If you're not already drafting based on a commander you've already settled on, if this card isn't going to be able to go into your deck, you might be inclined to remove it from the draft in order to beef up Animus of Predation. This would give the Animus flying, first strike, vigilance, and lifelink. So if you know you won't use the card, but you also don't want to draft anything else from that booster pack, you can use it to make the Animus quite the force to be reckoned with. While this ability is interesting, I personally find it too narrow and too risky. I'd rather just try and draft wish effects to try and access off-colored cards from my sideboard, so Animus of Predation and cards like it aren't in my commander queue. That being said, if you want to include it as a way to give players options to make the most of off-colored cards they can't play with, go for it. Cockwork Grinder is similar to Animus of Predation except that you remove cards from the draft in order to give it +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield. It costs 6 to cast, so even make it worthwhile, you have to remove at least 6 cards from the draft. So you're depriving yourself of 6 cards just to have a 6/6 without ability. That being said, it does give some use to dead picks you know you won't use. However, it's still a risk because you'd have to pick Cockwork Grinder well before you start picking dead cards. So if this is in a pack in the last round, it's quite the feel bad to draw. I don't run it in my cube and I don't think anyone else should either, especially if your cube is balanced. Agent of Acquisition goes above and beyond helping players with analysis paralysis when it comes to making their pick from a booster pack. When you draft it, you have to do so face up. Then when you receive a pack in which you'd rather pick multiple cards from it instead of just one, you can simply cash in your Agent of Acquisition. You turn it face down and then you draft each card from that booster. You don't even have to reveal them. However, if you do, you can't draft any more cards during that round. You can at least look at the packs being passed to you. You just can't pick anything else until the next draft round. This is a pretty solid card even if you don't use it in your deck. It's a 2/1 for 2 mana that doesn't bring anything else to the table. However, drafting this gives you the opportunity of drafting a ton of good cards from a pack by drafting all of them. Not being able to draft anything else balances it out quite nicely. I also have this card in my cube and I recommend it for anyone else's commander cube. Cockwork Librarian is an amazing card and I love the mini game this brings when drafting. If you draft this, you have to draft it face up. But then when you get a booster you want to draft 2 cards instead of 1 from, you can do so and then put the Cockwork Librarian back into that booster before you pass it along. So it essentially replaces itself with a card you really want from the draft. It's a 3/3 for 4 mana without any abilities, so it's definitely drafted solely to use with its draft ability. This is a great card that makes drafting even more fun and I highly recommend including it in your own cubes. I run it in mine and it's been amazing. Theovolt's Operative is similar to Cockwork Librarian, but you don't return it to the booster from when you drafted 2 cards. Instead, you just turn it face down and then skip drafting from the next pack you're passed. In this respect, I feel like the Librarian is a much better card, since it's fun to see it be used by a lot of different players, sort of like a hot potato. But I still run Theovolt's Operative as well in my cube since it can still allow me to pick 2 cards from a booster. If you plan accordingly, you might pick 2 amazing cards from the same booster and then skip on a booster from which you didn't really want anything. So I definitely suggest running it in your cube. It's also a 3/2 elf for 3 mana, so that might also be relevant as well depending on your cube. Canal Dredger is another great card for Constructed because of its activated ability, but it's completely ridiculous in a cube, especially if you're drafting with 8 players. It's a 1/5 for 4 mana that can tap to bottom deck a card from your graveyard, which is amazing in decks like Grenzo Dungeon Warden. Either way, it's a way to somehow recover cards from your graveyard. However, the reason it's amazing for cube is its draft matters ability. You have to draft it face up. However, as long as you have it drafted, each player passes their final pick to you. Sure, it might seem like you'll be getting jank and trash. However, if you curated a balanced cube, that won't always be the case. Thanks to having drafted this, you'll be drafting 3 additional cards each round if you're drafting with 4 players or 7 additional cards when drafting with 8 players. That definitely increases your pool for building your commander deck afterwards. This card is obviously in my cube and I highly recommend it for anyone else's commander cube, especially if you've built it like mine since you also get 3 additional mana fixing lands at the end of the draft. Deal Broker is another amazing card in Constructed since it's a 2/3 looter for just 3 mana, allowing it to be played in any deck. However, in Limited, it's also amazing since it gives you a mini game at the end of the draft. Once the draft is over, you can reveal a card from your pool to auction off to the rest of the table. Obviously, the best card to choose is a bomb you can't run, but also one you don't mind another player running. Then any player interested in it will present a card of their own. You then trade your card for the one of your choice. I love this effect and hope more cards are printed with it in the future. This one is definitely in my own commander cube and I suggest everyone else include it in their own. Lore Seeker is another auto-include for Commander Cubes. It's a 2/2 for 2, which isn't bad, but the most important thing about it is that when it's drafted, an additional booster is added to the draft. Whoever drafted Lore Seeker picks first and then passes the pack along. Unless you have a set amount of cards in your cube in which all of them are always drafted and there's nothing left in your cube afterwards, this is definitely worth including, and it's definitely in my own Commander Cube. Cockwork Spy is a 2/1 with flying for 3, which isn't so bad. However, I feel like its draft ability is too underwhelming to make it worth a slot in a Commander Cube. You get to look at the next card drafted from that booster pack. Maybe if it were a 2/2 flyer for 2, but as it is, it's too underwhelming and almost anything else is a better pick than this, especially in a balanced and well-curated cube. This should be a hard pass. Illusionary Informant is almost identical to the previously mentioned Cockwork Spy, but for the trade-off in being blue, it lets you look at the next card drafted by any player. Even then, that's not enough to convince me to run this in my cube over any other much better card. Peeking at someone's next pick isn't as bad if you're drafting actual booster packs in an actual limited environment. But in a cube where you can curate it with whatever card you want, it just seems like a waste of a slot to me. Just like Cockwork Spy, this one's a hard pass. Spire Phantasm is another card similar to Cockwork Spy and Illusionary Informant. However, instead of just looking at the next card they draft, you guess it first. If you guess correctly, then Spire Phantasm draws you a card whenever it enters the battlefield. A 3/2 flyer for 4 mana that might draw you a card when it enters the battlefield is bad considering how many other cards we're able to include in a cube. So it, just like the other 3, are not included in my Commander Cube and don't recommend anyone else to run them either. Whisper Gear Sneak is even worse than these 3. It's a 1/1 for 1 without any abilities, which isn't that impressive in Commander. It could have at least been unblockable. In any case, when you turn it face down, you get to look at any unopened booster pack in the draft or any booster pack not being looked at by another player. While sometimes there might be a particular player who always ends up taking forever in the draft and they have like 5 boosters waiting for them to make a pick, this card is not worth it to run in a cube. To say there are way better things to include instead is an understatement. Archdemon of Paliano, curiously enough, is amazing in constructed but bad and limited. On its own, it's a 5/4 demon with flying for 4 mana and no drawbacks. However, if you include it in a cube, it's going to get drafted and thus its drawback will come into effect. Not only do you have to draft it face up, but while it's face up, you have to draft packs at random. When you do, you turn the Archdemon face down. I do not have it included in my cube for that very reason. This is great in constructed but not worth a slot in limited. Cockwork Tracker is interesting in that if you draft it, you have to note the player who passed you the booster it was in. It's a 4/4 for 4 that attacks each turn if able, but it can only attack the player whose name was noted. Although an interesting ability is just that, interesting, it's nothing else. If it had Menace, then it would have been more flavorful as well as more useful as well. However, as it is, this is another hard pass. I would not include it in any Commander Cube. Custody Peacekeeper is one of a handful of Draft Matters cards that cares about how many cards you drafted that turn. So it's bad as an early pick but amazing as a late pick. So it also makes it harder to let go near the end since you don't want an opponent to draft it. So unlike the mind games that this can generate during a draft. Basically, this is a 2/3 trapper for 3 mana. You pay 1 white and tap it to tap a creature with power less than or equal to the number of cards you had drafted that round including itself. While the ability is not bad, other trappers can tap down any creature without restrictions on power. It's not a bad card, but if there are better cards than it, I wouldn't include it, not even for the novelty. I don't run it in my Commander Cube and don't really recommend anyone else to do it either. Lurking Automaton has the same mechanic as the previously mentioned Custody Peacekeeper, in which the amount of cards you drafted before it, and it as well, matters. In this case, this one is way better than Custody Peacekeeper, and even more so than Cockwork Grinder, since it has the potential of being an epic beater. As seen in the first episode of this mini-series, my Commander Cube is drafted in packs of 20 cards. So even if this was your 10th pick, it's going to be a 10-10 when it enters the battlefield. If you're building a deck focused around +1/+1 counters, then you're definitely going to want to pick it. Just try not to pick it too early, nor so late that someone else picks it when it gets big enough. It might not have any form of evasion, but if it was your 15th pick, then it's going to enter the battlefield with 15 +1/+1 counters all for just 5 mana. I have it in my cube and I recommend it for anyone else's Commander Cube. It's not an auto-include, but it's definitely a great one. Pyretic Hunter is an improved version of Lurking Automaton, but it trades being red for having Menace. So unless your commander has red in its color identity, you won't be able to run it. That being said, having an XX with Menace for 5 mana is something to scoff at, especially if you're drafted as your 6th pick and beyond. I've seen players have this enter the battlefield with over 10 +1/+1 counters on turn 3, and it's just insane. I run it in my own Commander Cube and you should as well. It's an amazing beater. Garbage Fire is a similar card, but this time it's about the amount of damage you can deal to a creature. It's quite possible to have this deal well over 15 damage to a creature. Although it might primarily be used as spot removal, if that were the case you might be better off running an actual spot removal spell. However, if you have cards in your cube that care about damage being dealt by spells, like Firesong and Sunspeaker or Soulfire Grandmaster, just to name a couple. In that case, this spell is actually crazy if you also manage to draft these cards. However, even though these cards are also in my cube, I cut Garbage Fire from my cube because it wasn't as impacting as I wanted and wasn't really used as often as I expected. I needed to make a cut in my red cards, so it was that one. That being said, it's still a great card and I recommend it to anyone looking for something different in their cube. Regicide is one of the 2 cards that are tied to what your opponents choose. This one is interesting because opponents are naturally going to want to choose a color they're not running. Either way, someone's going to lose a creature to it. So having a 1 mana instant speed response to a creature that's 1 or more of the 3 colors chosen as this draft is nothing to scoff at. Although I don't run it in my own cube, I definitely recommend it to anyone wanting something different and budget in their cube. Similarly to Regicide, Paliano the High City is another card that depends on what opponents choose. I have this in my cube and every single time it's been drafted, the 2 opponents always choose red and white. I would know because I always choose white when it's presented to me. That being said, you can use this psychologically to your advantage. I once saw this drafted by a player running a 5-color deck, one running a red-white-black deck, and another running a red-green-white deck. So it's actually beneficial for those opponents to always choose red and white. So it's quite entertaining to say the least when that player reveals a commander that can make the most of this red-white extra color Paliano. I run this in my cube as part of the mana fixing lands section of my cube. It's a fun land to run and it's quite the mind game, so I recommend you run it in your own commander cube if you like those kinds of things, especially since it's a 3-color mana tapping land that doesn't enter the battlefield tapped. Although this video was more like an episode of a flight, I hope it was helpful in showcasing the couple of dozen cards with draft matter mechanics on them. Unfortunately, not all of them are good enough to include in a cube. However, there are still a handful of them that are amazing and can definitely add an extra element to a cube to make it different and more enjoyable. Especially since most of these cards aren't even seen in constructed commander decks even though they're technically legal to run in them. As for my own cube, I'm only running the ones I've been mentioning throughout the video as I've been analyzing them. If you haven't already and want to take a gander at the current version of my commander cube, you can find links to it down in the description. I have way more topics to cover in greater detail and depth for this mini-series, so stay tuned. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank everyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of Commander Cube Draft on the Commander Tavern. I am the Meta Kirby, and happy drafting.